We are privileged to have with us today Matthew Bishop, who is the chief business writer and the U.S. business editor of The Economist. Economist is a revered publication founded in 1843 and based in London. But it is interesting to note that 53% or so of its readership resides here in North America, and that it has a worldwide reputation as a journal not only of finance, but of culture, politics, etc. I guess the closest, it's a weekly newspaper, and it makes no bones about calling itself a newspaper, although it's printed on glossy paper and appears naturally nowadays on the web. Matthew is based in New York City, and he was previously The Economist's London-based business editor and has also served as the New York bureau chief of The Economist. He's the author of several Economist special survey supplements, and I may point out the co-author of a recently published book called Philanthrocapitalism, co-authored with Michael Green, which delves into the kind of new wave of helping the world's poor. In other words, the rich, how the rich can save the world is the subtitle. I think that speaks for itself, and Matthew will lead us through the ins and outs of what this all means a little later. Matthew is also the author of Essential Economics, the official Economist layperson's guide to economics. Before joining the business school, before joining The Economist, Matthew was on the faculty of the London Business School, so he has an academic background as well. He co-authored 3 books that were published by Oxford University Press, and he is regarded as one of the 100 most influential business writers in the United States of America. So here's a man who has a little clout, and he's going to try to give us an idea today of how one becomes a business journalist, and how one stays on top of his game in this very complex world. And also, perhaps we can start in a general way by asking him, today of all days, when the U.S. House of Representatives are making a decision that will have strong global ramifications, how did the free markets get into this mess?
You're starting with the easy questions, eh?
Well, that's a pretty general one.
So the cover we have this week is of, which I'm sorry I didn't bring with me, but the cover is basically a man standing on a cliff top looking down and wondering whether to jump, I think. This is the end of the world, and as we know it, and it's really been an extraordinary time, as you've all seen in the markets. We've had to basically be changing our cover. Every time we think we know what our cover is going to be, we seem to be changing it and rewriting all our articles several times a day, which is, I guess, normal practice on a daily, but not on a weekly. So the problems we've been. Well, let's take a step back. I mean, you mentioned The Economist being founded in 1843. It was founded by a group of people who really believed in free trade as being the answer to poverty. That if you had a time of huge food prices in the world, the poor couldn't afford to eat. In some ways, similar to the situation we have today, a lot of protectionist rhetoric. And the people founded the paper with this belief that you needed to apply intelligence to the news. You needed to analyze the news, ask tough questions about the news, seek the truth, but also advocate for what you believe in. And that's a very delicate balance between advocacy and reporting. And we have a mission statement, which is to take part in a severe contest between intelligence which presses forward and timid ignorance that stands in the way of progress, which is a big vision, and that's what we had in the first editorial of the magazine that was written back in 1843. And so to bring that very much imbues our culture as a magazine. We argue about everything. You get into the elevator at The Economist, see one of your colleagues, and you probably argue about the weather before you get up to the room, and then whatever the news is of the day, you're arguing all the time. What does it mean? What's the significance? And we, in terms of your question you just asked, we've been worried as a magazine about, or a newspaper as we call it, we've been worried about the American financial system for at least a decade. I can remember writing articles in 2001 about Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and how they presented us a threat to the financial system. We've written about the dot-com bubble when that happened as being something that was unsustainable, and then have subsequently written lots of articles about how the growth of derivatives, the growth of the housing market was unsustainable. And, I think there's been in America an unwillingness from the people in power to actually speak the truth about the sort of risks that the American people were being exposed to. There was a failure of governance within the firms that, at the heart of the financial system, they didn't think through the risks they were taking properly, and there were also elements of fraud where people had incentives to sell mortgages that people really weren't capable of affording. And one of the things, I sit on the judges panel for the Loeb Awards, which is the premier business journalism awards. And what's striking is that you're seeing some of the best reporting on this crisis, on the mortgage part of the crisis, came out of local newspapers in some of the most affected markets. And people were journalists just going about their daily job, were hearing stories about mortgage fraud. And, I guess the best financial banks like Goldman Sachs are scouring the press and were spotting those stories first, and others didn't. And and clearly we at The Economist were making these cases that there were problems for a long time, and they weren't heeded. So I think we've come to a situation where the system is really fundamentally broken. If this bailout doesn't go through, we are on a precipice, as we have on our cover this week. The world economy could sink into a depression. We all know what happened in the 1930s. This is not identical to the 1930s, but one of the themes of the 1930s was that you took an economic a stock market crash and an economic slowdown, and then policymakers turned that into a depression by stopping trade, by going too tight on credit markets and so forth. You can see how a different form of politics today could produce similar results, and so we're at a very, very dangerous moment. One of the things I worry about is that the public no one's really explaining to the public what the situation is, and I think that's again something that is a challenge to all us as journalists, that understand this stuff and report it in language that people understand, and that hasn't happened enough. I think people have just said, the housing market's going up and up and up, get in the housing market, rather than saying, well, why is it going up? Is it sustainable? Who's bearing the risks? What happens if it all goes wrong?
So the public is not educated about this. Whose fault is that? The Economist does not write for the general mass of people, does it? It writes for a select group of power brokers, an educated class of people. Who will explain these things to use the cliche that you've heard a lot lately, Main Street?
Well, I'd first of all take issue with what you say about The Economist. I think one of the things that we've found is that we used to think we were writing for those elite power brokers, and part of our readership is, it is the decision makers. But we've also found that as our circulation has grown quite dramatically in the last 7 or 8 years, that there's been a real spread across the population, all sorts of people that basically are curious about what's going on in the world and want to understand it. And so, the doorman in my building in Manhattan is he's an Economist reader, and he's always sort of challenging me about the articles that I've written and that kind of thing, which is great. I mean, I love that, and I think, you know, one of the things that we
how's his 401k doing?
Well, I mean, he's looking at. I think he's doing all right. You know, he seemed, you know, I think that's part of the thing. I mean, people that there has been in the press good, very, very good journalism about business and about investing and about, you know, diversifying and so forth. But what I would say is that one of the things that the Economist, that an editor will say to you straight away is, you know, what have we said about this before? How does your story pitch take the story forward? And can it be understood by any Economist reader anywhere in the world? And so there's a real emphasis on making sure that we understand what we're talking about before we start writing, and that we really work hard to explain difficult concepts to the public. And I think actually, although it's not an easy read because it looks so dense with all the words on the page and very small pictures and a lot of not much white space, it is actually easier to read than, say, the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times, in terms of there's this focus on vocabulary being, you know, the shortest words you can possibly use rather than long words, because as a journalist you're very short on space in The Economist, so you really have to use a short word when you can, and also that a lot of our readership is in countries where English is not the first language, and so again, as an editor, when I was in London doing the business editing, I was constantly saying to people, you know, think about how does a reader in India or China, or, I mean, India obviously they're more of a first language, but still China or Asia, you know, how are we making sure that it can be understood? And, you know, we have to explain what the subprime mortgage market is before we can start denouncing it or celebrating it or whatever. So, and I think that is the role the media can still play here. And as I say, I do think some of the best journalism highlighting the problems that were building up in the mortgage market came out of just ordinary beat journalists in small towns listening and reporting. And I think that ultimately is the value that is fundamental to all good journalism.
Economic journalism, business journalism, is a kind of a growth industry nowadays, you would agree. How would you advise students who are interested in this field to train themselves? What mindset do you think they need? What skills do you think they need to get into this very exciting new, almost in a sense, new burgeoning field of journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason it's burgeoning is because that's where the money is and that's where the power increasingly is. So in business nowadays, you know, business is big, business is global. As I've written in this book, I mean, one of the phenomena that's going on is that big business and the super wealthy entrepreneurs like Bill Gates and others are not only making money in business, but they're also increasingly setting the agenda in global politics on dealing with issues ranging from climate change to global poverty and indeed sort of the global culture clash. And so, you know, that's where the power is. And so I would advise those who do get the chance to be business journalists to take it very seriously and see it as a big opportunity. And then there are some practical issues. I mean, one is a lot of people feel they can't understand business. It's just, you know, too difficult. That's, I think, a lot of the time because there's jargon that's used to obscure what are actually fairly simple ideas. So I think the principle in journalism that if you ask a question and the person you're asking looks at you as if you're stupid, that doesn't mean you're stupid. That may mean you're asking a good question and you need to persist with it. You know, I mean, I interviewed Bill Gates for the book, and twice he said to me, "You can't possibly mean that question. That's the most stupid thing I've ever heard." And you know, fortunately, I've sort of done it enough to know that you just press on and say, "Well, okay, this is why is that stupid?" Or but actually, there's a lot of intimidation in business journalism as there is in writing about politics or writing about anything else. And you just got to have a bit of faith in your own judgment and the fact that this stuff is not that complicated. Actually, follow the money is a good principle. See where it's going. The other thing is that, which I understood about business from a colleague called Tom Easton, who is a New York journalist who trained by doing some of the local newspaper stuff first of all, and then worked up through Forbes magazine. He said at Forbes magazine they asked him to be the mutual fund correspondent, which he thought was about the most boring job that you could be asked to do. And then he realised, as he looked at mutual funds, that basically there are mutual funds that invest in almost everything. And so if you're interested in any subject under the sun, you can find a mutual fund that has an investment strategy that requires you to know about it, whether it be global politics or how people are treated in a town where there's a brownfield site that's being closed down or whatever, like, that used to be occupied by a big chemicals company, or if it's about guns or whatever. I mean, he was into motorbikes, so he found a fund that had big Harley Davidson holding, and so he went and wrote about that. And actually, so it's a business, and the thing about business is that everything has a business angle on it. And so if you're interested in writing about anything, you can get actually through the business lens to write about it. So see it as a great opportunity. And also, a lot of journalists, when you get to, even at The Economist, where we're supposed to all be business journalists, if you know anything about business, even if it's not very much, to those journalists and editors that don't feel they know anything about it at all, you intimidate them very quickly, and they're impressed by your knowledge and take your pictures much more seriously. So I think it's actually an area where, from a purely practical point of view, if you can get some expertise in it, it actually will help you get ahead faster in your career.
How do you apprentice as a business journalist or an economics journalist?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think that has been booming, and I mean, who knows where it goes from here, but I think essentially it is a big, it is still going to be a growth industry, is the trade press. So almost every industry has a magazine or two magazines that, of newspapers that are not of great quality by and large. Some are great, but most of them are not all that exciting. But spending 6 months to a year doing one of those, just covering an industry, even if what you're writing is not necessarily stuff you're all that excited about, the people you meet and the understanding of the industry will stand you in good stead, and then you can then decide where you go from there. But I mean, the newswires and Bloomberg and Reuters and AP then have very specialist niche business reporters who will cover one sector in great detail. Again, I think that's the sort of thing you want to do for a little while, unless you decide to commit to being a lifetime business writer. But it's a place where you can get deep knowledge about one part of the economy, which I think is worth doing in the same way it's worth spending time doing a local newspaper job for a year and just learning the discipline of reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, you kind of want to, I would say, move into an area where you could be writing more broadly, and that probably means one of the magazines or something like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, or getting onto the business pages of one of the, either a Newsday or a Daily News, or, I mean, actually, the New York Post, funnily enough, has one of the more highly regarded business sections of any daily newspaper in America. So there are opportunities there as well.
Is that the Murdochian influence?
It could. No, I think it's just a tradition of the Post, really. It's just New York's the business capital of the world in some ways, and so it's done the job in a way of where again, it's journalists have to actually explain, make sure they understand what they're doing, because the reader is a more general reader.
Mm-hmm. On that subject, and it's a little off subject, really, what do you think of the stewardship of Rupert Murdoch and the Wall Street Journal so far? Do you have any ideas about that are not less than inchoate at this point? Or?
I mean, so far he's not done anything that I feel is fundamentally, corrupt. I mean, I think that the worry is that you worry that he's going to come in and take away what was one of the great journalistic brands in the world and the great journalistic cultures. And there's obviously been a lot of turnover in the staff. The thing it's been criticised for most has been putting political news on the front page and less business news. But I think one of the things we found at The Economist is that actually to be informed about, to be a business reader means you actually want to know about the political context in which business is operating. And if you don't understand the political context, then your business decisions are likely to be poor. And so I don't actually fault the Journal for doing that. I was disappointed that Marcus Broccoli, the editor-in-chief, stepped down without a fight, because having established an editorial independence board,
he caved.
I think you owe it to your staff to at least go through that, even if maybe it wouldn't have stood the test in the end, that you owe it to your staff to go down fighting. But
they sweetened it.
They did, which again is disappointing. And,
Yes.
but I guess hopefully at the Washington Post he'll rediscover his backbone or whatever.
Well, let's talk. I'm sure you won't mind if we talk a bit about your book.
Sure.
Just
out this week, available on Amazon.com.
How do you define philanthrocapitalism?
So it's really about how many of the winners, the people who the wealth creators, are increasingly concerned about solving some of the world's most pressing problems that used to be left to the domain of government or to mass charity, and it's now something that you're more likely to get action and common sense out of business leaders and tycoons than you are out of people in politics about how you actually deal with issues like climate change and so forth. And I think the reason we wanted to write the book was that, firstly, I was finding as I was reporting that many of these people I wanted to talk to about business were also very much engaged in philanthropy and actually in some ways more passionate about how they could use the money to actually change things than they were about their business. But also that clearly a lot of people, there's been a sort of a shift in the sort of people why people go into business now, and people feel they're going into business not just to make money but to make a difference. So that's also something that top management is trying to figure out. How do I meet the demands of my new workers who want to do something that matters? And so those themes really interested me. But it also seems to me to raise a lot of big questions about politics. When you have people like Bill Gates or Michael Bloomberg who are extraordinarily wealthy, and then you go to other parts of the world where you've got a less developed political system sometimes, and again the wealthy playing a very, very important role in setting the political agenda. It seemed to me something that the public needs to know who these people are, what makes them think, what makes them tick, what ideas are they trying to achieve, what are their goals, and how do we hold them to account and let them fulfill their potential, because I do think someone like Bill Gates has the potential to solve, to drive solutions to some of the great problems facing the world that governments have given up on. But how do we make sure he does that in a way that we feel doesn't undermine our democratic rights and indeed the rights of the people in the parts of the world where he's spending his money? And so it seems to me we need to have a huge public debate about this, and hopefully the book is going to trigger that debate. And we have a website as well. I'll just mention that. I mean, part of this age is that you create a website that when you launch a book, and it's called philanthrocapitalism.net. And I've got a blog on there which I'm doing, really around the interviews that I do with people. If I come away with a particular thought, and we interviewed Russell Simmons, the hip hop star, yesterday about he has this hip hop summit where he's getting rap stars and financial advisors to teach people about personal finance, and address financial literacy questions, which I was fascinated by, and he's now trying to take that global to go to parts of the world where there's no financial education at all. So we'll probably blog about that, and I'll probably write about it in The Economist in a couple of weeks. So there's lots of, but I just think it's now increasingly you run into politicians who realise they have to go to the wealthy and big business to get things done. I mean, we had an interview with Bill Clinton at the weekend where, he's had this huge event last week called the Clinton Global Initiative, where he was getting business people and the wealthy to work with non-profits to make big pledges to achieve things. And again, this is not a game. It needs to be scrutinised properly. And I'm excited that journalists are now seeing that whole area as an area which needs proper reporting. 5 years ago, there was no one really reporting on that area, and now the main publications
Isn't also the idea to use business practices to make sure that the money gets into the right place?
Well, that's the other thing. I think that with following their interest, we're getting this sense that the entrepreneurs really think that they know how to solve problems, and so they're using techniques of business to try and solve some of these problems. And I think we're only in the early days of that. You take someone like the people at Google. I mean, they're saying, well, we understand information and searching information better than anyone in the world. Well, some of the world's big problems, like how do we identify a pandemic quickly? How do we get resources to people on the ground when there's a humanitarian disaster? Or indeed, how do we deal with this problem in many developing countries where the government is unaccountable? How do we create information feedback that can hold governments to account? And they've actually set up a part of Google called Google.org, which it's just devoted full time to this social mission of how do we use what we're good at as a company to actually address some of the world's big problems. And I think we're seeing a lot of action there. We're seeing a lot of action in terms of creating internet and social networking systems that allow people who aren't billionaires to actually give more effectively and to know where their money's going. So I love Kiva.org, which some of you will have come across, which is a microfinance site where you set up by a couple of guys or two guys, one of the guys' wives was, I think, the person who came up with the idea, just to directly lend from here to someone on the ground out in Africa. Right. So there's a lot going on that's really exciting and I think needs to be reported on.
There's so many questions I have, but time is short, and I would like to open the floor to certain questions. If anyone has a question for Mr. Bishop, please. Yes, sir?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, or good morning, rather. My name is Bernard Clark. I'm attending the Gordon Community College. Mr. Bishop, I'd like to ask you, how exactly did you become a journalist? What manner of schooling did you undergo?
So I went to an American-style public school, so in Britain. So I came from an ordinary middle-class family, and but one where parents were very focused on making us learn to read and so forth. So it was a good educational environment. And then I got a place at Oxford University to study economics. After that, I got a job as an academic researcher writing about economics. And in the course of that, I started to write one or two journalistic articles to try and explain some of the big economic reforms that were going on at the time, and became aware that there was a job available at The Economist, and then wrote off several articles that I thought were Economist-like articles, and eventually they said, come in and spend 6 months and see how it goes, and it kind of went from there, really. And so The Economist is where I really learned how to be a journalist properly. So I wasn't trained as a journalist, I was trained as an economist.
Were there any earlier publications?
No, I mean, not really. I mean, I did a few freelance pieces, but I think one of the things about The Economist is that it's very strongly edited to have a single voice, so it feels like one person has written the whole magazine. There are no bylines, and so which is how it used to be 70 or 80 years ago. Everyone else got bylines as the individual journalist became more important. The Economist, it's much more a sense that we all are jointly responsible for the output that we have, which is why we debate so much, because I hate the thought that someone's going to come up to me and say, did you write that terrible article? Because they don't know who's written it. And so if someone ever says that to me, I go back straight away and say, well, look, who wrote that article? I want to make sure that they don't write such rubbish again.
Isn't there a downside to not having bylines, which is that the follow-up stories are not...
That's the big... That is the big downside, is that I think if you're writing for the Daily News and you write an article and someone else knows about that subject and they think, well, you're kind of 2/3 of the way along the story, but there's a bigger story here, they'll phone you up.
Right.
Whereas they phone up The Economist, and to some extent it goes into sort of the black hole, really. And so, but the web is helping in that respect, because now it's much easier for people to kind of go into our website and sort of figure out, or send an email in that will probably get distributed to 3 or 4 journalists who might be the right one, at least. So it's getting better.
What kind of courses would you recommend for someone who's interested in writing for a business or finance publication?
Well, I mean, I think a basic economics course is always good, and I would also do a basic finance course. Although I think all those finance courses are going to have to be ripped up and rewritten after the last year, so I'm not sure how much you're going to get out of that. But I think something that gets you able to understand broadly, what the difference between the level of a stock, a bond, a derivative, a swap, an option, something at that level, just so that it doesn't intimidate you more than anything. Something that gives you a basic idea of how a balance sheet works. I mean, I don't think you need to go beyond the basic courses unless you really want to become, an academic. Actually, I mean, I think it's the basic language that is the key. I mean, that's partly why I wrote this other book we mentioned, Essential Economics, which was really designed to put in very layman terms in 2 or 3 paragraphs on a whole number of the terms that we use in The Economist. What do they mean? And I think in some ways that plus a basic course is quite a good way to know the basics.
I have a personal question.
Yeah.
Do you balance your checkbook every month?
I try to.
Yes, this gentleman there.
Yeah, I mean the question is really about who's qualified to be a journalist. We've got all these blogs appearing. Are they the same? Do they carry the same weight as a traditional trained journalist? That kind of thing. Who decides who's in and who's out? In a sense, that's the broad gist of the question. My view, and it's somewhat against the mood of the times, but ultimately I think quality content is king, and at the end of the day, those who emerge from this extraordinary transition in the industry of journalism, which is going to is seeing the whole industry remade, and what journalism industry looks like in 10 years is going to be fundamentally different from what it was 10 years ago, and is already significantly different. But at the end, those journalists that are going to survive and prosper are going to be those who really understand what they're talking about, are really disciplined about getting the facts right, but then also being able to provide the context for those facts to their readers, so that the readers understand the significance of the facts that they're reading. And so, I suppose that has obvious implications for blogging. There's a lot blogging. There's very low barriers to entry, but I think ultimately those that survive as bloggers are going to have an economic model at the end that keeps them fed and able to do their reporting. And so I think there'll be a huge attrition rate, because only the very best will survive, and many of those will end up working for the brands that survive in the media world as well, because those brands are still, the one thing they do is actually say, well, we're putting the brand of the New York Times behind our bloggers, and therefore the same editorial rigor is going to apply to them. And so I think as a reader, one of the things The Economist I think has done very well at is cutting through this vast amount of information that's out there, and we're saying to our readers, you're busy people with a curiosity about the world. You give us 2 hours each week, and we will give you everything you need to know about the world, the most relevant stuff for you in 2 hours. If you spend that 2 hours with us, that we'll leave you so that you can, any information you encounter over the next week, you're going to feel by and large reasonably well prepared to know what it's about and what's going on. That's what we're aiming to do each week. And many people are overwhelmed by the amount of information and reporting out there. So we're going to see a lot of news is becoming commoditized, and the stuff that will rise above the pack is going to be the stuff that's high quality and relevant to the reader. And I just think a lot of blogs don't achieve that.
It's Darwinian in a
It is Darwin, and we are in a. I think no one should have any illusions that journalism, is clearly going through a massive Darwinian shakeout. And as I said, those that are going to survive in this industry, and there will be survivors. It will be the brands that really focus on knowing who their reader is, deepening the relationship with the reader, providing what the reader values, and making and that I think will be really rigorous, informed clear writing and report.